I was 34 years old when I realized my entire family had been lying to me about love. But let me start from the beginning, because if you've ever felt like you were fighting for scraps of affection from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, you'll understand exactly how this story unfolded. And if you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're from, because what I'm about to tell you transcends geography. Pain like this? It's universal. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept up on me like morning fog, starting with small inconsistencies I'd been trained to ignore since childhood. My name is Sarah, and for 34 years, I believed I was the problem child in a family that simply had high standards. My older brother Marcus was the golden child, Harvard MBA, successful investment banker, married to the perfect surgeon wife Rebecca, two beautiful kids who looked like they belonged in a Gap commercial. Then there was me, the divorced graphic designer with no children, living in a cramped apartment in Portland, struggling to make ends meet with freelance work and wondering why I never seemed to measure up. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, our house was always immaculate. My mother, Patricia, never just mom, had this way of making everything look effortless while simultaneously making you feel like your very existence was creating chaos. She'd glide through rooms in her pressed slacks and silk blouses, adjusting throw pillows that nobody had disturbed, wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. Dad worked long hours at his accounting firm, and when he came home, he'd retreat to his study with a whiskey and the Wall Street Journal. The house felt like a museum where children were barely tolerated visitors. Marcus excelled at everything without trying. Honor roll, varsity tennis, student council president. When he brought home a 98 on a test, Dad would beam and talk about how proud he was. When I brought home the same grade, the response was always, well, what happened to the other 2 points? I learned early that my achievements were expected, not celebrated, while Marcus's achievements were proof of his inherent superiority. The pattern continued through college and beyond. When Marcus graduated from Harvard, our parents threw a massive party, inviting half the neighborhood. When I graduated from art school, we went to dinner at Applebee's, just the 4 of us. When Marcus bought his first house in Westchester, Dad helped with the down payment and spent weekends helping with renovations. When I needed help moving into my studio apartment, I hired movers and did it alone. But here's the thing about being the less favored child. You develop this desperate need to prove yourself worthy. You become hypervigilant about family dynamics, always searching for signs that maybe, just maybe, you're finally enough. So when my divorce was finalized 3 years ago, and I was at my absolute lowest point, barely keeping my head above water emotionally and financially, I threw myself into being the perfect daughter and sister. I remembered every birthday, sent thoughtful gifts I couldn't afford, flew back to Connecticut for every holiday, even when I could barely afford the plane ticket. I organized family photo sessions, planned elaborate Mother's Day celebrations, and spent hours on the phone listening to my mother complain about her book club drama or her neighbor's loud dog. I became the family's emotional labor specialist, the one who smoothed over tensions and made sure everyone else was comfortable. And slowly, I started to notice things that didn't add up. There was the way conversations would pause when I entered a room, then resume with forced brightness. The inside jokes that stopped mid-sentence when they remembered I was there. The family group chat that I somehow never got added to, where they'd make plans and then act surprised when I didn't know about them. When I'd ask about it, the response was always the same. Oh, we just assumed you were too busy with work, or we didn't want to bother you. Last Christmas, I spent $1,200 I didn't have flying back east and buying presents for everyone. I found out later that they'd had a family dinner the night before I arrived, just the 4 of them plus Rebecca and the kids. When I asked why I wasn't invited, Marcus laughed and said, "It was just a casual thing. We didn't think you'd want to come." But Rebecca let it slip that they'd been planning it for weeks, complete with catered food and my mother's best china. The breaking point started building in February when Dad had what turned out to be a minor heart episode. I immediately booked a flight, took time off work I couldn't afford to lose, and spent a week at the hospital and then at their house, managing his medications, coordinating with doctors, and basically putting my entire life on hold. During that week, I overheard a phone conversation between my parents that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making Dad's lunch when I heard my mother's voice from the living room, crisp and clear. Well, at least Sarah is finally being useful for something. Heaven knows she's been nothing but a disappointment otherwise. My father's response was softer, but the words cut just as deep. Patricia, that's harsh. She's trying her best. And my mother's laugh, cold and sharp as winter air, followed by, her best has never been good enough, has it? Thank God Marcus turned out normal. I stood in that kitchen, holding a sandwich I'd made with the love and care I'd been pouring into this family my entire life, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, crack. Like when you tap a windshield and the fissure spreads slowly, inevitably, until the whole thing shatters. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and replaying 34 years of interactions with new clarity. The comments that had seemed thoughtless now felt deliberately cruel. The exclusions that had seemed accidental now felt intentional. The love I'd been chasing my entire life wasn't love at all. It was tolerance, and barely that. I started paying attention differently. I noticed how my mother's face would subtly shift when I walked into a room, like she was preparing for an unpleasant task. I noticed how my father never asked about my work anymore, but would spend 20 minutes discussing Marcus's latest promotion. I noticed how Rebecca would smile at me with the practiced warmth of someone who'd been coached on being polite to the family disappointment. But it wasn't until I decided to look through some old family photos that I found the smoking gun. Hidden in a box in my parents' closet, I was looking for childhood photos to create a photo album for Dad's recovery. I found pictures from family vacations I'd never been on. Christmas mornings when I was apparently at my ex-husband's family. Birthday celebrations I'd never heard about. A whole parallel family history where I simply didn't exist. The photos were dated. Recent photos. From the past 5 years, when I'd been desperately trying to insert myself back into their lives after my divorce. Photos of beach houses I'd never seen, restaurants I'd never been to, moments of joy and celebration that had been deliberately hidden from me. If you've ever had that moment where your entire reality shifts and you realize the story you've been telling yourself about your life isn't true, please hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started. What I found next made me question everything I thought I knew about family, love, and revenge. In that same box, underneath the photos, was a letter. Written in my mother's precise handwriting, addressed to Marcus. Dated just 6 months ago. The letter that would change everything and set in motion the chain of events that would culminate in that dinner, that coffee, and that moment when I finally stopped being the victim in my own story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because what happened next required patience, planning, and a level of strategic thinking I never knew I possessed. They trained me well. 34 years of trying to anticipate their needs, predict their moods, and position myself as indispensable had given me a masterclass in understanding exactly how this family operated. And I was about to use every single lesson they taught me. The letter was folded neatly, creased with the precision my mother applied to everything in her life. As I unfolded it, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that comes with finally finding the missing piece of a puzzle you've been solving your entire life. Dearest Marcus, it began, in my mother's careful script. I hope this letter finds you and Rebecca well. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about Sarah and the situation with the cabin. The cabin. Our family's lake house in New Hampshire that had been in Dad's family for 3 generations. The place where I'd spent every summer of my childhood, where I'd learned to swim and fish, and where some of my happiest memories had been made. The cabin that Dad had always promised would stay in the family forever. As we discussed, your father's health scare has made it clear that we need to make some difficult decisions about our assets. The cabin, as you know, has significant value now. The lake has become quite desirable, and we've had an unsolicited offer for $1.2 million. My breath caught. I'd had no idea the property was worth so much, or that they'd been discussing selling it. The difficult part, as you pointed out, is Sarah's emotional attachment to the place. You know how she gets about family traditions and sentiment. But as you so wisely suggested, we need to think practically about our future and your children's futures. The money would ensure your father and I are comfortable in our retirement, and there would still be a substantial inheritance for you and Rebecca. I had to read that paragraph 3 times. Marcus had suggested selling the cabin, knowing how much it meant to me, and they were all discussing my emotional attachment like it was an inconvenience to be managed. But the next paragraph made my blood run cold. I think your idea about waiting to tell Sarah until after the sale is final is the right approach. You know how she is, she'll make it all about herself and her feelings, probably cry, and carry on about childhood memories. It's better to present it as a done deal. She'll adjust eventually, and honestly, it's not like she ever contributed to the upkeep or taxes on the place. The letter continued, but the words started blurring together as rage built in my chest. They weren't just planning to sell the one place that had always felt like home to me. They were planning to do it behind my back, then present it as a fait accompli. But the final paragraph was what broke something fundamental inside me. I know I don't say this enough, Marcus, but I'm so grateful every day that you turned out to be the child your father and I dreamed of having. Sarah has always been challenging. Even as a baby, she was difficult, colicky, demanding. Sometimes I think if we'd stopped after having you, our lives would have been so much simpler. But then I remind myself that everyone serves a purpose, even if it's just to make us appreciate what we have in you. Give my love to Rebecca and the children. With all my love, Mother. I sat on the floor of my parents' closet, holding this letter that laid bare 34 years of my life in brutal honesty, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just hurt, I was used to hurt. Not just anger. I'd felt plenty of that. This was clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about who these people were and what I meant to them. They thought I was the family burden, the consolation prize, the child who existed only to make them appreciate their real child more. For 3 days, I walked around in a daze. I made Dad's meals, helped him with his physical therapy exercises, chatted pleasantly with my mother about her garden plans for spring. I played the role I'd been playing my entire life. The grateful, slightly disappointing daughter who's just happy to be included. But inside, I was taking inventory. What exactly did I know about my family's finances that they didn't know I knew? The answer was everything. You see, when someone considers you incompetent and uninteresting, they tend to forget you're in the room during important conversations. For years, I'd been present during discussions about investments, taxes, business decisions, and estate planning. I'd been the one who helped Dad organize his home office last year when he was preparing tax documents. I'd been the one who house sat when they went on vacation, watering plants and collecting mail and inadvertently seeing bank statements and financial documents. I knew about Dad's investment accounts, his retirement portfolios, the trust he'd set up for Marcus's children. I knew about the second mortgage they'd taken on the house to help Marcus with his down payment, something they'd never offered me. I knew about the life insurance policies, the credit accounts, and yes, I knew about the cabin's financials because I'd been the one to help Dad set up online banking for the property taxes last summer. More importantly, I knew something they'd forgotten. Dad had made me a co-owner and power of attorney on several accounts when I'd helped him navigate some banking issues during his brief hospitalization. It had been presented as a temporary convenience, just in case something happens and we need you to handle things. But the paperwork had never been revoked. I spent my last night in that house doing research. While my parents slept soundly in their bedroom, confident that their disappointing daughter was grateful for their tolerance, I was in the guest room with my laptop, mapping out exactly what kind of access I had to their financial world. The answer was complete access. I could see everything. Joint accounts, individual accounts, credit cards, investment portfolios, the cabin's deed and mortgage information. Years of treating me like invisible furniture during important discussions had given me an encyclopedic knowledge of their financial structure, and their assumption that I was too scattered and emotional to be a threat had led to some very careless trust. But I didn't do anything. Not yet. Instead, I flew back to Portland and began to plan. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, you understand the particular kind of power that comes with being invisible. They'd spent so many years dismissing my intelligence, my capabilities, my worth, that they'd forgotten a basic truth. The people you underestimate are often the most dangerous ones. I started with small research projects. I looked up property values in their neighborhood and found that their house had appreciated significantly more than they probably realized. I researched the lake community around the cabin and discovered that waterfront properties were selling for even more than the $1.2 million they'd mentioned. I looked into Dad's business and found some interesting information about recent changes in partnership agreements and retirement benefits. Then I did something that surprised even me. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. If my family was planning to deceive me about something as significant as selling the cabin, what else might they be hiding? The PI was a woman named Janet Morrison, a former cop who specialized in financial investigations and family disputes. I told her I suspected my family was planning to manipulate me out of inheritance assets, and I needed to know the full scope of what I might be dealing with. What Janet found over the next 6 weeks changed my understanding of everything. The cabin sale wasn't their only secret. They'd been systematically repositioning assets for the past 2 years, since Marcus had apparently expressed concerns about estate taxes and inheritance planning. Property had been transferred into trusts that excluded me. Investment accounts had been restructured with Marcus as the primary beneficiary. Even some of the family heirlooms and jewelry I'd assumed would be divided between Marcus and me had been formally gifted to Rebecca. But here's where it gets interesting. Much of this restructuring had been done incorrectly. In their eagerness to cut me out, they'd made legal mistakes that actually strengthened my position. Some transfers hadn't been properly documented. Some trust structures violated the terms of Dad's original estate planning. And in several cases, they'd moved assets that I still had legal claims to. Janet's final report was 63 pages of detailed financial analysis and legal vulnerabilities. As I read through it in my cramped Portland apartment, eating cereal for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries, I realized that my family hadn't just been emotionally abusing me for years, they'd been systematically stealing from me. The cabin was just the beginning. There was a life insurance policy that had originally listed me as a beneficiary but had been changed without my knowledge. There were stocks that had been gifted to me years ago, but somehow ended up in Marcus's portfolio. There was even a small trust fund my grandmother had set up for me that had somehow been consolidated into the family's general assets. But the most infuriating discovery was buried in the mortgage documents for Marcus's house. The down payment help I'd known about was actually much more extensive than I'd realized. My parents had essentially co-signed for a loan that was secured against the cabin's equity. Marcus's perfect life in his perfect house was literally being subsidized by the property I thought of as my childhood home. As I sat there surrounded by evidence of years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse, I realized that the hurt little girl who'd spent 34 years begging for love from people incapable of giving it was gone. In her place was a woman who understood exactly how power worked in this family, and who now held more cards than anyone realized. If you've ever been the victim of people who underestimated you, make sure you're subscribed, because what I did next took patience, precision, and a level of strategic thinking that would have impressed even Marcus with his MBA. The dinner where everything came to a head was still 2 months away. But I was already 3 steps ahead of them, and they had no idea what was coming. The thing about revenge is that it requires you to think several moves ahead, like chess played with real lives and actual consequences. Over the next month, while my family continued their secret planning for the cabin sale, I was building something they never saw coming, a trap made of their own arrogance and assumptions. I started with small tests, tiny probes to see how far their deception went and how careless they'd become. I'd call my mother and casually mention looking forward to summer at the cabin, just to hear her voice get tight as she made non-committal responses. I'd text Marcus about maybe bringing a friend to the lake this year, watching him dodge the conversation with vague promises that we'd figure it out later. Each lie felt like another piece of evidence I was collecting. They weren't just planning to betray me. They were actively deceiving me while I grieved over what I thought was Dad's health scare and poured my energy into being the good daughter. But the most important thing I did during this period was establish my own network of professionals. Janet had been invaluable for the investigation, but now I needed a team. I hired Rebecca Chun, an estate attorney who specialized in family disputes and financial fraud. She reviewed all of Janet's findings and confirmed what I'd suspected. My family had made numerous legal errors in their attempts to restructure their assets, and many of their actions could be challenged in court. I also opened new accounts at a different bank, accounts my family had no knowledge of, and began carefully documenting every financial transaction I could access through my existing authorizations. Every transfer, every payment, every account balance was meticulously recorded and stored both digitally and in hard copy. The most crucial step was updating my own legal status. I hired a financial advisor and began restructuring my own modest assets to protect them from any potential legal challenges. If my family wanted to play games with money and inheritance, I was going to make sure I was protected. But the psychological preparation was just as important as the financial maneuvering. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Williams, not because I thought I was unstable, but because I wanted to make sure I was approaching this situation from a place of strength rather than reactive emotion. I needed to understand the difference between justice and revenge, between protecting myself and destroying others. Dr. Williams helped me see patterns I'd been blind to my entire life. The way my family had systematically undermined my confidence while presenting themselves as loving and supportive. The way they'd trained me to doubt my own perceptions and always assume the best intentions from them. The way I'd been gaslit into believing that my emotional responses to their treatment were evidence of my own dysfunction. "Sarah," she said during one session, "what you're describing isn't just favoritism or family dysfunction. This is psychological abuse that's been going on for decades. The fact that you're just now recognizing it doesn't mean you're weak or stupid. It means you're incredibly resilient to have survived it." Those sessions gave me something I'd never had: permission to trust my own judgment. For 34 years, I'd been told that my perceptions were wrong, my feelings were oversized, my reactions were inappropriate. Now I was learning that my instincts had been right all along. Meanwhile, my family's deception was escalating. In late March, I got a call from Marcus asking if I'd be interested in taking a family vacation in late June, just the four of us, maybe somewhere tropical. When I asked about our usual summer plans at the cabin, he got evasive and said something about maybe switching things up this year. I played along perfectly, expressing enthusiasm for the tropical vacation while internally noting that late June was probably when they planned to finalize the cabin sale. They wanted me distracted and far away when the paperwork was signed. That's when I decided to accelerate my timeline. Using my financial access, I began gathering evidence of every questionable transaction from the past 5 years. The down payment help from Marcus that had never been properly documented as a loan versus a gift. The temporary transfers of assets that had become permanent. The gradual redirection of dividend payments and investment returns that should have been shared but somehow all ended up in Marcus's accounts. I also started building my own war chest. Using the same accounts they'd forgotten I had access to, I began moving money into investments and holdings they couldn't easily track or reclaim. Nothing illegal. Everything I did was within my legal rights as a co-account holder, but I was ensuring that when this confrontation happened, I wouldn't be financially vulnerable. By April, I had enough evidence to file legal challenges that would tie up their assets for years. I had enough financial independence to survive a protracted legal battle. And I had something more valuable than either of those things. I had complete surprise. They thought they were managing a difficult but ultimately powerless family member. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd spent 2 months studying their every move, documenting their every mistake, and preparing for war. The cabin listing went live on a Tuesday morning in early May. I found it by accident. I'd been casually browsing real estate websites, ostensibly looking at properties in Portland, but actually monitoring the New Hampshire market around our lake. There it was: historic waterfront family compound, private beach, dock, for BR/3BA, $1,350,000. They'd increased the asking price, and the photos showed the cabin I loved more than any other place on earth, described as a historic compound, with no mention that it was still a family home where someone had learned to swim and spent every summer of her childhood. I sat in my apartment, staring at those photos, and felt the last piece of my old self die. The part of me that had hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that maybe they'd include me in the decision, that maybe there was still a chance for this family to choose love over money, that part simply ceased to exist. What replaced it was someone I'd never been before, someone who understood that you can't reason with people who've already decided you don't matter. Someone who knew that when people show you who they are, you should believe them the first time. I called my attorney. Rebecca? It's Sarah. They listed the cabin. I think it's time to move forward. The plan we'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than challenging the sale directly, which could take years and might ultimately fail, we were going to challenge the entire structure of asset transfers that had been happening over the past 2 years. The cabin sale would be automatically frozen as part of a larger estate dispute that questioned whether my parents had been mentally competent when they'd made recent financial decisions, and whether Marcus had exerted undue influence over elderly parents. It was harsh, but it was also exactly the kind of aggressive legal strategy that Marcus himself would have used in a business dispute. I'd learned from the best. But I didn't want them to find out about the legal challenge from their attorneys. I wanted to tell them myself, in person, at a moment when they felt most secure in their deception. That's when I decided to invite myself to dinner. I called my mother on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May when I knew she'd be home from her book club, but before she started preparing dinner. I used my brightest, most grateful daughter voice. "Hi, Mom. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was just thinking about how much I miss you all, and I wondered if I could come for a visit this weekend. Maybe we could have one of those nice family dinners like when I was growing up." She was clearly caught off guard. "Oh, well, Sarah, this weekend might not be the best time. Your father has been a bit tired lately, and we weren't really planning on entertaining." "Oh, I don't need entertaining," I said, pouring sweetness into my voice. "I just want to spend time with my family. I could cook. Remember how I used to help you with Sunday dinners when I was little? It would be like old times." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her brain working, trying to find a reason to refuse that wouldn't sound cruel. Finally, she sighed in that long-suffering way I knew so well. "I suppose we could do something simple. But don't go to too much trouble, dear. You know how your father prefers things low-key these days." "Of course, Mom. I'll keep it simple. Just family, just us. I can't wait." As I hung up, I was already mentally preparing for what would be our last family dinner. They thought they were managing my emotions and keeping me distracted from their plans. What they didn't know was that I was about to serve them the surprise of their lives. If you're thinking this sounds like it's about to get intense, you're absolutely right. Hit that subscribe button, because what happened at that dinner changed everything, not just for me, but for every single person at that table. The stage was set. The players were in position. And I was finally ready to stop being the victim in my own story. I drove from Portland to Connecticut that Friday afternoon with my car loaded with groceries and a heart full of purpose. The 6-hour drive gave me plenty of time to rehearse exactly how this weekend would unfold. I wasn't just visiting my family, I was giving the performance of my lifetime. The Sarah who walked into my childhood home that evening was everything they expected, slightly overwhelmed, eager to please, grateful for their tolerance. I hugged everyone warmly, complimented my mother on her new living room arrangement, asked Dad detailed questions about his recovery, and gushed to Marcus about his latest promotion that I'd heard about through the family grapevine. "I brought everything for Mom's pot roast recipe," I announced, hefting grocery bags into the kitchen. I thought it would be nice to make all of Dad's favorite sides too. Just like the old days. My mother followed me into the kitchen, and I could see her mentally calculating how much work this was going to create for her. "Oh, Sarah, you didn't need to go to all this trouble. We could have just ordered something simple." No, I insisted, already unpacking ingredients with the manic energy they'd come to expect from me. "I want to do this. It's been so long since we've all been together, and with Dad's health scare, I want to make sure we don't take these moments for granted." It was perfect. Exactly the kind of emotional, slightly overwhelming gesture that reinforced their image of me as the needy daughter who tried too hard and never quite got it right. I spent the entire weekend playing this role to perfection. I cooked elaborate meals they didn't really want. I suggested family activities they politely declined. I brought up memories of childhood vacations and holidays with the kind of nostalgic enthusiasm that made them exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. On Saturday afternoon, while I was supposedly napping, I overheard Marcus and my parents having what they thought was a private conversation in the backyard. "She seems more emotional than usual," Marcus was saying. "All this talk about not taking family for granted and making memories. Do you think she suspects something about the cabin?" My mother's response was crisp. "Even if she does, what can she do about it? It's our property, and we can do what we want with it. She'll adjust eventually. She always does." "I just don't want any drama," my father added. "You know how she gets when she's upset. All that crying and carrying on." "Which is exactly why we're handling it this way," Marcus said. "Present it as a done deal. Maybe throw her a small bone from the proceeds to soften the blow. She'll probably be grateful we thought of her at all." Lying in my childhood bedroom, listening to them discuss me like I was a petulant child who needed to be managed, I felt that familiar clarity wash over me again. This wasn't family. This was a business operation, and I was the inconvenient variable they were trying to minimize. Sunday dinner was my masterpiece of performance art. I set the table with my mother's best china, the set she'd inherited from her mother and only used for special occasions. I lit candles, played soft classical music, and created exactly the kind of formal family dinner setting that I knew would make everyone slightly uncomfortable but unable to complain. As we sat down to eat, I raised my glass of wine in a toast. "I just want to say how grateful I am for this family. I know I'm not always the easiest person to deal with, and I know I sometimes try too hard, but you all mean the world to me. Whatever challenges come our way, I'm so glad we faced them together." The responses were exactly what I expected. Warm smiles that didn't reach their eyes, murmured agreements that felt hollow, the kind of performative family love that had been the soundtrack of my entire life. We were halfway through the meal when my mother decided to deliver the killing blow. I'd been talking about summer plans, carefully probing to see how they'd handle the cabin situation. "I was thinking it might be nice to spend a longer stretch at the lake this year," I said, cutting into my pot roast. "Maybe take some time off and really relax up there. It's been such a stressful year with Dad's health and everything." The pause was deafening. Marcus cleared his throat. My father suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. And my mother, with that precision she brought to everything, decided this was the moment to put me in my place. "Oh, Sarah," she said, with that particular tone she used when she was about to say something cutting but wanted it to sound like concern. "You know, I've been thinking about this weekend, about how hard you're trying to recreate some kind of perfect family experience." I kept eating, maintaining my mask of pleasant attention. And I realized that maybe we've been enabling some unrealistic expectations. The truth is, sweetheart, you tend to make everything about yourself and your emotions. Take this dinner, for instance. You've created this elaborate production that's really more about your need to feel important than about what anyone else actually wanted. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't intervene. Dad kept eating, pretending this wasn't happening. The cabin, the family gatherings, all of it, you attach so much drama and sentiment to everything. The rest of us have learned to be more practical, more realistic about what family actually means. She paused to take a sip of wine, and I could see her working up to the final blow. "If I'm being completely honest, Sarah, if it wasn't for pity, no one would have invited you to half the things you've been included in over the years. We include you because you're family, but let's not pretend it's because you add anything meaningful to these experiences. You're exhausting, dear. You're needy and dramatic, and you make everything harder than it needs to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at his plate. Dad continued eating like nothing had happened. And my mother sat there with a small, satisfied smile, clearly pleased that she'd finally said what she'd been thinking for years. This was it. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when the mask would finally come off for all of us. I set down my fork carefully, took a sip of my coffee, and smiled. "You know what, Mom? You're absolutely right." The surprise on her face was beautiful. She'd expected tears, arguments, maybe me storming out in a dramatic huff. She hadn't expected calm agreement. "I have been exhausting. I've been trying so hard to earn love from people who were never capable of giving it. But you've just done me the biggest favor of my life by finally being honest about how you really see me." I stood up from the table, still smiling. If you'll excuse me, I need to step outside for a moment. I have a few phone calls to make. As I walked toward the patio door, I heard my mother say to the others, "Well, that went better than expected. Maybe she's finally growing up. If she only knew." I sat on their back patio in the gathering dusk, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. Account after account, I systematically logged in and changed every password, every security question, every contact method. By the time I was finished, they were completely locked out of accounts they'd probably forgotten I had access to. Then I called Rebecca Chun, my attorney. Even though it was Sunday evening, she answered immediately. She'd been waiting for this call. "Rebecca? It's Sarah. Yes, it's time. File everything tomorrow morning. All of it." Next, I called Janet Morrison, my private investigator. "Janet, I need you to serve the legal papers personally. Tuesday morning, when they're all having coffee and reading the news. I want to be there to see their faces." Finally, I called the real estate agent who'd listed the cabin. I'd been monitoring the listing, and I knew they'd had several showings already. "Hi, this is Sarah Henderson. I'm calling about the lake property you have listed in New Hampshire." "Yes, I'm a member of the family." "No, you need to pull that listing immediately. There's a legal dispute over the property. You'll be getting formal notification tomorrow, but I wanted to give you a heads up so you don't waste anyone's time with showings this week." When I walked back into that dining room, they were discussing vacation plans for the tropical trip Marcus had suggested, their reward to themselves for handling the Sarah situation so smoothly. "Everything okay, dear?" my mother asked with false concern. "Everything's perfect," I said, sitting back down and finishing my coffee. "I just had to take care of some business matters. You know how it is." They had no idea that in the space of 20 minutes, I'd just dismantled their entire financial strategy and set in motion legal proceedings that would freeze every asset they'd tried to hide from me. But the best part? I wasn't done yet. I drove back to Portland that Sunday night with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't replaying family conversations and wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could have been better. Instead, I was counting down the hours until my family would discover that their exhausting, dramatic daughter had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. Monday morning, I woke up early and went for a run, something I hadn't had the energy for in months. The Portland streets were quiet, misty with that Pacific Northwest drizzle I'd grown to love, and I felt more alive than I had since my divorce. Maybe even longer than that. I'd taken the week off work, telling my clients I had a family emergency to handle. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was about to emergency evacuate myself from a toxic family system that had been poisoning me for 34 years. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone rang. Rebecca Chun, calling with an update. "Sarah, it's done. We filed the emergency injunction this morning, along with a full estate dispute. The cabin listing has been officially suspended, and all asset transfers made in the past 2 years are now under legal review. They should be getting served with papers within the hour." What about the accounts I locked yesterday? That was brilliant timing. By changing those access codes right after your mother made her statement about pity invitations, you've created a clear timeline that supports our argument about the family's pattern of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. Their own words are going to be used against them. I could hear the satisfaction in Rebecca's voice. She specialized in family financial disputes, and she told me that cases with this much clear documentation and this many obvious legal errors were rare. "Most families are smarter about covering their tracks," she'd said. "Your family's arrogance is going to be their downfall." At 10:30 a.m., my phone started buzzing with text messages. "Marcus. Sarah, call me immediately. There's been some kind of mistake with the family accounts." "Dad. Sarah, honey, I can't access the business account. Can you help me figure out what's wrong?" "Mom. Sarah, this is ridiculous. Call me back right now." I ignored them all and went to get coffee at my favorite cafe. If you've ever been in a situation where people who usually ignore you suddenly need your help, you know how satisfying it is to be completely unavailable when they're panicking. By noon, the call started. First Marcus, using his business voice. "Sarah, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to call me back immediately." There are legal papers here that make no sense, and several accounts are locked. This needs to be resolved today. Then my father, sounding confused and worried. Sarah, sweetie, there are some men here with papers about the cabin and something about estate disputes. I think there's been some kind of mistake. Can you please call us back? Finally, my mother, using the tone she'd perfected when I was a teenager and had broken curfew. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with this tantrum, but you are going to call me back right now and explain yourself. This is completely unacceptable behavior, even for you. I saved all the voicemails. They were perfect evidence of the exact dynamic I'd been describing to my therapist and attorney, how quickly they shifted from dismissing me as irrelevant to demanding my immediate attention when they needed something from me. At 2 p.m., I finally answered when Marcus called for the 7th time. Sarah, thank God. What the hell is going on? There are lawyers here saying we can't sell the cabin, something about you claiming financial fraud and elder abuse. This is insane. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic, which was interesting. Marcus never panicked. Marcus solved problems with spreadsheets and conference calls. Hi, Marcus, I said pleasantly. How are Rebecca and the kids? Don't give me that fake cheerful bullshit, Sarah. I need to know what's happening right now. What's happening is that I finally stopped being naive about who you people really are. There was silence on the other end. The cabin sale is suspended pending a full investigation into the family's financial decisions over the past 2 years. Turns out, when you systematically exclude someone from decision-making while they're legally entitled to be included, and when you try to hide asset transfers that affect their inheritance, you open yourself up to some pretty serious legal challenges. Sarah, you're being ridiculous. We never tried to hide anything from you. I actually laughed. Marcus, I have recordings of you and Mom discussing how to keep the cabin sale secret from me until it was final. I have documentation of asset transfers that were never properly disclosed. I have evidence of Dad being pressured into financial decisions when he was on pain medication after his heart episode. Would you like me to continue? Another long silence. What do you want? And there it was, the question I'd been waiting for. Not, how can we fix this relationship? Or, we're sorry for hurting you. Just, what do you want? The language of negotiation, not family. What I want, Marcus, is for you all to experience exactly what it feels like to have important decisions made about your life without your input or consent. What I want is for you to understand that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken against people you consider powerless. This is going to cost everyone a fortune in legal fees, Sarah, including you. Is your wounded pride really worth destroying the family's financial security? My wounded pride? I could hear my voice getting sharper, and I took a breath to regain control. Marcus, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about justice. You've all been stealing from me for years while convincing me I was lucky to be included at all. The wounded pride belonged to the old Sarah, the one who died yesterday at dinner. Mom said you were acting strange at dinner, but I thought you handled her honesty pretty well. Her honesty? The word came out like a bark of laughter. Marcus, do you want to know what honesty looks like? Honesty looks like me admitting that I've hated every family gathering for the past 5 years. Honesty looks like me acknowledging that I've been funding my own emotional abuse by spending money I couldn't afford to fly back and buy presents for people who discuss me like I'm a burden. Honesty looks like me finally admitting that this family is toxic, and I'm done being the scapegoat. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. The legal proceedings will take as long as they take, Marcus. Maybe months, maybe years. In the meantime, no assets get moved, no property gets sold, and everyone gets to live with the uncertainty that I've been living with my entire life. Sarah, be reasonable. Oh, I'm being extremely reasonable. I'm using the exact same legal and financial strategies that you would use in a business dispute. I'm protecting my interests with the same ruthless efficiency you've always admired in yourself. The only difference is that this time, I'm the one with the power. I hung up before he could respond. Within an hour, my phone was ringing again. This time it was my father. Sarah, honey, I think there's been a big misunderstanding. Can you please come home so we can talk about this face to face? His voice was shaky, and for a moment, I felt a stab of the old guilt. But then I remembered the letter in my mother's handwriting, the one where she talked about wishing they'd stopped after having Marcus, and the guilt evaporated. Dad, there's no misunderstanding. There's just finally honesty about how this family operates. But sweetheart, we love you. We've always loved you.
No, Dad. You've tolerated me.
There's a difference, and I've finally learned to see it. The cabin has been in our family for generations, Sarah. You can't just stop us from making decisions about our own property. Actually, I can. Because while you've all been treating me like I'm too stupid to understand finances, I've been paying attention to every detail of how this family's money works. I know exactly what I'm legally entitled to, and I know exactly how to protect it. There was a long pause. What would it take for you to drop this legal action? Another negotiation question. Not, how can we rebuild our relationship, but what's your price for going away quietly? Dad, the legal action isn't punishment. It's protection. For the first time in my life, I'm protecting myself from this family instead of trying to earn acceptance from people who were never going to give it. But the legal fees, Sarah, this is going to cost everyone so much money. You know it's cost me money, Dad? 34 years of trying to buy love from people who saw my affection as a transaction. Plane tickets I couldn't afford, gifts you didn't want, therapy to figure out why I never felt good enough, career opportunities one missed because I was always dropping everything to help family members who never reciprocated. My voice was steady, calm. I wasn't yelling or crying or having the kind of emotional breakdown they'd learned to expect from me. The financial cost of this legal dispute is nothing compared to what your emotional manipulation has already cost me. The difference is, now the cost gets shared equally. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Portland skyline and felt something I'd never experienced before, the absence of anxiety about my family's opinion of me. For 34 years, there had been this constant background hum of worry about whether I was good enough, whether I was doing enough, whether I was enough. Now, for the first time, that frequency was simply gone. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "This is the most selfish, vindictive thing you've ever done. You're destroying this family." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm just finally refusing to be destroyed by it." Then I blocked her number. If you've ever had to cut toxic people out of your life, even family, you know that the hardest part isn't the confrontation. It's the moment when you realize that the people you've been fighting for don't actually know who you are. They're angry at losing control, not at losing you. But this story is far from over. Because what happened next showed me that my family had been hiding more than just financial plans. They'd been hiding the kind of desperation that makes people do truly ugly things when they're cornered. 3 days after the legal papers were served, I learned something crucial about my family. They were much more vicious than I'd anticipated when their carefully constructed world started falling apart. It started with a call from my landlord. "Sarah, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but I got a call from someone claiming to be your brother. He said there was a family emergency, and you might be having some kind of mental health crisis. He wanted to know if I'd noticed any unusual behavior from you." My blood ran cold. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. It's none of his business, and honestly, it seemed really inappropriate. But I thought you should know that someone was asking questions about you. Marcus was trying to build a case that I was mentally unstable. Classic move. When you can't challenge someone's legal position, you challenge their mental capacity. An hour later, my boss called. "Sarah, I got a strange call today from someone claiming to be concerned about your welfare. They said you'd been making erratic decisions, and they were worried about your mental health. I told them it was inappropriate to contact your workplace, but I wanted to give you a heads up." The pattern was becoming clear. My family was systematically contacting people in my life, trying to paint me as mentally unstable to undermine my legal case. It was brilliant, actually, exactly the kind of strategic thinking Marcus would excel at. If they could prove I was having a breakdown, they could challenge my legal standing and my financial decisions. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They didn't understand how isolated my Portland life was from my family. The people they were calling barely knew them, and their interference came across as suspicious rather than concerned. Still, I called Rebecca Chun immediately. They're trying to build a mental competency challenge, she confirmed after I'd filled her in. It's a common tactic in estate disputes when the financial case is weak. But Sarah, the fact that they're doing this actually strengthens our position. It shows a pattern of manipulation and attempts to control you. What do I need to do to protect myself? First, document everything. Save the voicemails from your family members. Record the details of who they contacted and when. Second, I'm going to arrange for you to have a psychological evaluation with a court-approved psychiatrist. We'll get ahead of this and prove that you're completely competent and acting rationally. And third, we're going to add harassment and defamation to the legal complaint. They just escalated this beyond a family financial dispute. That evening, as I sat in my apartment documenting every contact from my family and every person they'd tried to turn against me, I realized that the mother who'd raised me, the father who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and the brother I'd looked up to my entire life were now actively trying to destroy my reputation and my mental health to protect their money. It should have hurt more than it did. But I'd already grieved the loss of the family I thought I had. Now I was just dealing with the enemies they'd revealed themselves to be. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for the following Monday. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for legal cases. The 3-hour assessment was thorough: cognitive tests, personality inventories, detailed interviews about my decision-making process, and my family relationships. Ms. Henderson, she said as we wrapped up, I want you to know that in my professional opinion, you're demonstrating exceptional emotional intelligence and strategic thinking skills. The way you've approached this family conflict shows careful planning, appropriate emotional regulation, and a clear understanding of cause and effect. She paused, reviewing her notes. I've seen many cases where family financial disputes bring out the worst in people. Usually, the person filing the legal challenge is acting from pure emotion, anger, hurt, revenge. But your approach has been methodical and proportionate to the actual harm you've documented. If anything, you've been more measured in your response than many people would be. Her report would be submitted to the court within 48 hours. But more importantly, it gave me something I'd never had: professional validation that my perceptions and reactions were not only normal but healthy. That validation became crucial when the attacks escalated. On Wednesday morning, I found an email in my inbox from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year, my ex-husband David. Sarah, I got a call from your brother yesterday. He's concerned that you might be having some kind of breakdown and making dangerous financial decisions. He asked if I'd noticed signs of instability when we were married. I told him that was completely inappropriate and I wouldn't discuss our private relationship, but I wanted you to know he's reaching out to people from your past. The email continued. For what it's worth, the way he described you sounded nothing like the person I was married to. I may have my own issues with how our marriage ended, but I never questioned your mental health or your intelligence. What you're dealing with sounds horrible, and I hope you have good support. It was surreal, getting validation from my ex-husband while my blood family was trying to destroy me. But it also showed me just how far Marcus was willing to go. He was literally calling everyone he could think of from my past, trying to find someone who would support a narrative of mental instability. Thursday brought the most vicious attack yet. I was at the grocery store when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my cousin Jennifer's number, my father's sister's daughter, someone I'd always been close to but hadn't spoken to in months. Sarah, what the hell is going on with your family? Your mother called my mom last night, absolutely hysterical, saying you've had some kind of psychotic break and you're trying to steal the family's money. I stood in the produce aisle, holding a bag of apples, and felt the world tilt slightly. She said you've been making wild accusations about financial fraud, that you've hired lawyers to attack them, and that you're trying to force them to sell their house to pay legal bills. She was crying, Sarah. I've never heard your mother cry. The performance was masterful. My mother, who prided herself on never showing weakness, was now playing the role of the devastated mother whose mentally ill daughter was destroying the family. And it was working. I could hear the doubt in Jennifer's voice. Jennifer, can I ask you something? In all the years you've known me, have I ever been dishonest with you? Have I ever been manipulative or vindictive? Well, no, but have you ever seen me act irrationally or make impulsive decisions? No, But Sarah, my mom said a lot of things. Can you do me a favor? Can you ask my mother for specific examples of my supposed mental instability? Ask her for dates, incidents, witnesses. Ask her to show you any evidence of these wild accusations I've supposedly made. There was a long pause. Sarah, are you okay? Really okay? Jennifer, I've never been better. I'm finally protecting myself from people who've been hurting me for years. But I understand why that might look crazy to people who don't know the whole story. Can you tell me the whole story? So I did. Standing in that grocery store, I told my cousin everything. The letter I'd found in my parents' closet. The secret asset transfers. The cabin sale they'd planned to hide from me. The financial investigation that had uncovered years of manipulation. The dinner where my mother had finally said what she really thought of me. When I finished, there was a long silence. Oh my God, Sarah. I had no idea. I mean, I always thought they were harder on you than on Marcus, but I never realized this is horrible. The thing is, Jennifer, I'm not asking anyone to choose sides or get involved. I'm just asking people to consider the source when my family starts spreading stories about my mental health. They're panicking because their financial manipulation has been exposed, and they're trying to discredit me instead of addressing the actual issues. What can I do to help? It was the first time since this whole thing started that anyone from my extended family had offered to help instead of judge. Just remember that there are always two sides to every story. And maybe ask yourself why they're working so hard to convince everyone I'm crazy instead of just explaining why they thought it was okay to exclude me from decisions about property I have legal rights to. After I hung up, I stood in that grocery store and realized something profound. The people who truly knew me weren't buying my family's narrative. It was only working on people who already had a superficial impression of me as the difficult family member. But it also showed me that my family was in full attack mode now. The financial freezes were hurting them, the legal delays were costing them money, and they were fighting back with everything they had. I called Rebecca Chun from the parking lot. They're escalating the character assassination campaign. My mother is calling extended family, crying about how I've had a psychotic break. Sarah, this is actually good news for our case. Every person they contact, every false statement they make about your mental health, every attempt to manipulate others into supporting their narrative, it all becomes evidence of their pattern of manipulation and abuse. It doesn't feel like good news. It feels like they're trying to destroy my relationships with anyone who might support me. I understand. But here's what I need you to remember. They're doing this because they're losing. The financial case is solid, your mental health evaluation came back completely normal, and now they're getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. She was right. But living through their desperation was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every day brought new attacks, new people they'd contacted, new lies they were spreading. It was like being under siege from people who were supposed to love me. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and thought about something Dr. Williams had said in one of our sessions. When you stop enabling dysfunctional people, they don't just get disappointed. They get vicious. Because your compliance was never about your relationship with them. It was about their ability to control their own narrative. My family's vicious response wasn't really about the money, though the money was important to them. It was about control. For 34 years, they'd controlled the story about who I was, what I was worth, and what I deserved. Now I was telling a different story, one where their behavior was the problem, not my reaction to their behavior. They were fighting so hard to discredit me because they couldn't afford for their version of reality to be questioned. If I wasn't the difficult, dramatic, mentally unstable daughter, then what did that make them? If you've ever been in a situation where people responded to your healthy boundaries by attacking your character, you know how isolating and exhausting it can be. But you also know that their reaction tells you everything you need to know about who they really are. Subscribe if you want to see how this psychological warfare played out, because what happened next showed me that sometimes the people who claim to love you will do anything to maintain their power over you, anything except actually examine their own behavior. 2 weeks into my family's character assassination campaign, I got a call that changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of their deception. It was Janet Morrison, my private investigator, and her voice had an edge of excitement that immediately got my attention. Sarah, you need to sit down. I've been digging deeper into your family's financials, following up on some inconsistencies I found in the initial investigation, and I've uncovered something big. I was in my home office, surrounded by legal documents and evidence files that had taken over my dining table. What kind of something big? The kind that explains why they're fighting so hard to discredit you and why they're so panicked about the asset freeze. Sarah, your family has been stealing from you for a lot longer than we thought, and for a lot more money. She discovered that the financial manipulation went back over a decade, starting right around the time I'd graduated from college. There was a trust fund my grandmother had established that I'd never known about, money that was supposed to have been used for my education and then transferred to me at age 30. Instead, it had been gradually absorbed into the family's general investments, with my parents as trustees making decisions that consistently benefited Marcus while leaving me with nothing. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Including growth and compound interest over the past 15 years? Around $400,000. I nearly dropped the phone. $400,000. While I'd been struggling to pay rent, taking freelance jobs I hated, eating ramen noodles, and wondering why I couldn't seem to get ahead financially, there had been nearly $500,000 that was legally mine sitting in accounts controlled by people who thought I was too dramatic and needy to deserve it. But that's not all, Janet continued. Remember that life insurance policy we found that had been changed? I dug deeper into the insurance company's records. Your grandmother didn't just set up a trust fund for you, she also took out a life insurance policy with you as the beneficiary. When she died 8 years ago, your parents collected $200,000 that was supposed to go to you. The room was spinning. They told me grandmother left everything to them because they'd taken care of her in her final years. That's partially true. The house and most of her assets did go to them. But there were specific provisions for you that they never disclosed. Sarah, we're looking at over $600,000 that's been systematically diverted from you over the past 15 years. $600,000. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Money that could have paid off my student loans, helped me start my own business, maybe even bought me a small house. Money that had been mine all along, held by people who spent those same 15 years making me feel like I was a financial burden on the family. The trust fund diversions might be legally complicated to recover, Janet continued, but the insurance money is clear-cut fraud. Your parents collected life insurance proceeds under false pretenses and never disclosed them to the rightful beneficiary. Why are you just finding this now? Because they were smart about hiding it. The insurance payout went into an account at a completely different bank, and then it was gradually transferred into investment accounts under different names. It took some serious forensic accounting to trace the money trail. But you found it. I found it. And Sarah, this explains everything about their reaction to your legal challenge. It's not just about the cabin, and it's not just about recent asset transfers. If this comes out in court, they're looking at criminal fraud charges, not just a civil dispute over estate planning. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the evidence of 15 years of theft and wondering how I'd been so blind. But I knew the answer. I'd been trained from childhood to trust them, to assume their decisions about money were made with everyone's best interests in mind. Even when those decisions seemed to consistently benefit Marcus and leave me struggling, I'd assumed it was just coincidence or that they knew something about finances that I didn't. The cruelest part was realizing how many times I'd asked for their help over the years, how many times I'd swallowed my pride and admitted I was struggling financially, only to be told that they couldn't afford to help me or that I needed to learn to be more responsible with money. They'd watched me struggle while sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars that belonged to me. I called Rebecca Chen immediately. "This changes everything," she said after I'd filled her in on Janet's discoveries. "We're not just dealing with estate planning disputes anymore. This is criminal fraud, and it's been going on for over a decade." "What does that mean for the legal case?" "It means we have them completely cornered. They can't afford to let this go to trial now, because criminal charges would destroy not just their finances, but their reputations. Marcus's career in finance would be over. No investment firm would keep someone who'd been convicted of insurance fraud." So, what happens next? Now we negotiate from a position of absolute strength. They're going to want to settle this quietly and quickly, before the criminal aspects become public. But first, I had to confront them with what I knew. I decided to do it the same way they'd been conducting their campaign against me, with phone calls designed to destabilize and control. But unlike their calls to my landlord and employer, my calls would be based on facts and documentation. I started with Marcus. Sarah, thank God you're calling. We need to talk about ending this legal nonsense before it gets completely out of hand. You're right, Marcus. We do need to talk. I just learned some interesting things about grandmother's estate that I think you'll want to discuss. The silence on the other end was telling. What about grandmother's estate? Well, for starters, I now know about the life insurance policy she took out with me as the beneficiary. The one that paid out $200,000 when she died. The money that somehow never made it to me. Another long silence. Sarah, I think there might be some confusion about. There's no confusion, Marcus. I have documentation from the insurance company showing the payout, and I have bank records showing where that money went. I also know about the trust fund grandmother established for my education, the one that's been systematically emptied to fund other investments. Look, Sarah, these are complicated financial arrangements that you don't understand. I understand them perfectly. I understand that you've all been stealing from me for 15 years while making me feel like I was a burden on the family. I understand that while I was eating ramen noodles and stressing about rent, you were using my inheritance to fund your perfect life. It's not that simple. Actually, it is that simple. You committed insurance fraud, Marcus. You and Mom and Dad collected money that legally belonged to me and never disclosed it. That's not a complicated financial arrangement. That's a felony. The word felony seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I could hear his breathing change. What do you want, Sarah? I want my money back. All of it. With 15 years of compound interest. And I want a written apology acknowledging what you've done. That's impossible. The money's been invested. It's tied up in various assets. Then you'll need to liquidate assets to pay me back. Just like I've had to liquidate my entire life savings multiple times over the years to cover expenses that this money should have handled. Sarah, be reasonable. If we have to sell investments and property to pay this back, it'll destroy the family's financial security. I actually laughed. Marcus, you're talking to someone whose family destroyed her financial security 15 years ago and then spent the next decade and a half pretending it was her own fault for not being good enough with money. This will ruin us. No, this will hold you accountable. There's a difference. After I hung up, I called my parents' house. My father answered. Sarah, honey, Marcus called and said you've been talking about some kind of misunderstanding about grandmother's estate. It's not a misunderstanding, Dad. It's criminal fraud. And I have all the documentation to prove it. The phone went quiet for so long, I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was shaking. Sarah, I need you to understand that we never meant to hurt you. The decisions we made seemed reasonable at the time. Dad, you collected my inheritance and spent it without telling me. You watched me struggle financially for years while sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars that belonged to me. How did that seem reasonable? We thought we were making better investment decisions than you would have made. You were so young and you'd just gotten divorced and you thought you knew better than I did about my own money. We were trying to protect the family's assets. You were trying to protect Marcus's inheritance by stealing mine. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with my father alternating between justifications and apologies, but never quite admitting what they'd actually done. Finally, my mother got on the phone. Sarah, this vindictive behavior needs to stop right now. You're tearing this family apart over money. Mom, you stole $600,000 from me over 15 years. This isn't vindictive behavior. This is me finally standing up for myself. We never stole anything. We made financial decisions as a family. You made financial decisions about my money without including me in the family that was making the decisions. You can't have it both ways. If you proceed with this legal action, you'll destroy your father's health and Marcus's career. Is that what you want? It was the same emotional manipulation they'd been using my entire life, making me responsible for managing everyone else's feelings and protecting everyone else's interests while nobody protected mine. Mom, what I want is for you to take responsibility for your actions instead of blaming me for the consequences. We raised you better than this, Sarah. Actually, you didn't. You raised me to be a victim who would accept whatever treatment you decided to give her. But that person is gone now. That night, I sat in my apartment looking at 15 years' worth of financial documents and felt something I'd never experienced before. Righteous anger. Not the desperate, pleading anger of someone begging to be treated better, but the calm, focused anger of someone who finally understood exactly what had been done to them and was prepared to do something about it. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Sarah, please let's meet in person to discuss this reasonably." I typed back, "All communication goes through my attorney now. You have 48 hours to provide a settlement offer that includes full restitution plus interest, or we proceed to criminal charges." The next day, Rebecca Chin called with news that my family's attorney had requested an emergency meeting to discuss settlement terms.
"They're panicking," she said.
And they should be. "Sarah, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that they're going to offer you everything you're asking for." Everything. They can't afford to have this become public. Marcus's career, your parents' reputation in their community, the potential criminal charges, they're looking at losing everything if this goes to trial. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not happiness. The betrayal still hurt too much for happiness. But satisfaction that finally, after 34 years, the balance of power had shifted. They were going to learn what it felt like to be powerless in the face of someone else's decisions about their future. If you're wondering whether money can really change family dynamics this dramatically, stay tuned. Because what happened in that settlement meeting showed me that some people will only treat you with respect when they're afraid of the consequences of not doing so. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Rebecca Chen's law office in downtown Portland. I'd insisted on meeting in my territory, using my attorney, under my terms. For once, my family would have to accommodate my schedule instead of the other way around. Marcus flew in Monday night. My parents drove up from Connecticut, arriving Tuesday morning looking like they'd aged 5 years in the past month. I watched them walk into the building through Rebecca's office window, my mother clutching Dad's arm, Marcus trailing behind them with the expression of someone facing a firing squad. I'd spent the previous evening with Dr. Williams, my therapist, preparing emotionally for this confrontation. We talked about the difference between justice and revenge, about setting boundaries versus seeking punishment, about what I actually wanted from this meeting beyond the money. "Sarah," she'd said, "you're about to have more power in this family dynamic than you've ever had. How you use that power will determine not just the outcome of the situation, but who you become moving forward." I'd thought about that all morning as I dressed carefully in my best business suit, armor for the most important meeting of my life. Rebecca had arranged for a court reporter to document everything, and she'd prepared a settlement agreement that would resolve both the civil and potential criminal aspects of the case. The terms were simple: full restitution of all misappropriated funds with compound interest, a formal written apology acknowledging their actions, and a restructuring of all family trusts and assets to ensure transparency and legal compliance going forward. When they walked into the conference room, the dynamic was unlike anything I'd experienced with my family before. For the first time in my life, they looked at me with something approaching fear. Not fear of my emotions or my reactions, fear of my power. My mother, who had never entered a room without immediately taking control of it, sat quietly in her chair and barely made eye contact. My father, who had always been the ultimate authority on family financial decisions, looked defeated before we'd even begun. And Marcus, brilliant, successful, always in control Marcus, looked like a man who finally understood that his mistakes were going to have real consequences. "Before we begin," Rebecca said, addressing their attorney, "I want to make clear that this settlement meeting is my client's attempt to resolve this matter privately and avoid the public exposure that would accompany criminal charges. But that offer is contingent on full cooperation and complete honesty about the scope of the financial improprieties." Their lawyer, a nervous man named Phillips who kept adjusting his glasses, nodded quickly. "My clients are prepared to discuss full restitution." "Good," Rebecca continued. "Let's start with the insurance fraud. My client is owed $200,000 from her grandmother's life insurance policy, plus 15 years of compound interest at the market rate, which brings the total to approximately $340,000. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're prepared to pay that amount. Excellent. Now, let's discuss the trust fund that was established for my client's education and then diverted to other investments. The principal amount was $120,000, which with proper investment returns over 15 years should have grown to approximately $400,000. That's... Marcus started to object, then stopped when their lawyer put a warning hand on his arm. We're prepared to discuss that amount as well, Philip said. Rebecca smiled pleasantly. I'm glad to hear it. So we're looking at total restitution of approximately $740,000 plus legal fees and court costs. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. I watched my parents' faces drain of color, watched Marcus calculate what liquidating that much money would mean for his own financial security. However, Rebecca continued, my client has additional terms beyond monetary restitution. This was the part I'd insisted on, despite Rebecca's advice that I might be overplaying my hand. First, she requires a written apology that acknowledges the specific actions taken and their impact on her life. Not a generic, we're sorry for any misunderstandings, but a detailed admission of what was done. Second, she requires complete transparency regarding all family financial assets, trusts, and estate plans going forward. No more secret meetings, no more hidden asset transfers, no more financial decisions made without her knowledge or input. Third, the family cabin will be transferred to my client's sole ownership, free and clear, as additional compensation for 15 years of emotional distress and financial manipulation. That's impossible. My mother spoke for the first time, her voice sharp with panic. That cabin has been in the family for generations. I looked directly at her. So, was the money grandmother left for me, but that didn't stop you from spending it. The room fell silent again. Phillips cleared his throat. My clients would like a moment to confer privately. Rebecca nodded, and we stepped out of the conference room. In the hallway, I could hear raised voices through the door, my family's careful public composure finally cracking under pressure. How do you think it's going? I asked Rebecca. They're going to agree to everything, she said confidently. They can't afford not to. The financial restitution alone won't destroy them, but the criminal charges would. Marcus would lose his securities licenses, your parents would face potential jail time, and the whole family would be publicly humiliated. And if they don't agree, then we proceed with criminal charges, and they end up paying the money anyway while also facing prosecution. They're smart enough to do the math. 20 minutes later, we were called back into the room. My family looked like they'd been through a war, but their lawyer was nodding. My clients agreed to the financial terms, Philip said. $740,000 plus legal fees, to be paid within 60 days. And the other terms? They agreed to the transparency requirements regarding future financial decisions. And the written apology? A long pause. They agreed to provide a written statement acknowledging their mistakes. And the cabin? Another pause, longer this time. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, that cabin, it's been in my family since my grandfather built it. It's where I learned to fish, where I taught you and Marcus to swim. It's not just property to me. It's our family's history. For a moment, I felt the old Sarah stirring, the daughter who would have immediately backed down, who would have prioritized his feelings over her own rights, who would have accepted less than she deserved to avoid making her family uncomfortable. But that Sarah was gone. Dad, I learned to swim in that lake too. I have just as much emotional connection to that place as you do. The difference is, you were willing to sell it without even telling me it was happening. You were going to let me find out that my childhood home had been sold when someone else mentioned it in passing. The money from the sale was going to help secure your mother's and my retirement. With the money you stole from me over the past 15 years. He flinched like I'd slapped him. The cabin transfer is non-negotiable, I continued. You can visit whenever you want. I'll never exclude family the way you excluded me. But the property itself comes to me as part of this settlement. Marcus leaned forward. Sarah, be reasonable. That property is worth over $1 million. Combined with the financial restitution, you're asking for almost $2 million total. I'm asking for 15 years of my inheritance that you spent without my knowledge, plus the emotional damage of being systematically excluded and manipulated by my own family. $2 million seems like a bargain for what you've put me through. The final silence stretched for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, my mother spoke.
Fine.
You can have the cabin. You can have all of it. I hope it makes you happy. Her voice was venomous, but I could hear the defeat underneath the anger. It's not about happiness, Mom. It's about justice. The paperwork took another 3 hours to finalize. Bank account numbers were verified, property transfer documents were prepared, and the written apology was drafted and redrafted until it met my requirements. When my family finally signed everything, they looked like they'd been physically beaten. As they prepared to leave, my father paused at the door. Sarah, I want you to know that despite everything, I love you. I looked at this man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and felt nothing. Not hatred, not love, just a vast emptiness where family feeling used to be. Dad, I know you believe that. But what you call love, I call control. What you call family loyalty, I call manipulation. We have very different definitions of these words. So this is it? You're just going to cut us out of your life completely? I'm not cutting you out. I'm just not going to pretend anymore that our relationship is something it never was. If you want to rebuild something real, something honest, I'm open to that. But it would have to be based on who we actually are, not on the roles you assigned us 34 years ago. After they left, I sat in Rebecca's office staring at the settlement documents that represented the most money I'd ever had and the end of the family I'd grown up believing in. How do you feel? Rebecca asked. Tired, I said honestly, and relieved, and scared. Scared that I'll miss them. Scared that I'll start second-guessing myself and wondering if I did the right thing. Scared that I'll go back to being the person who would accept being treated badly just to maintain the illusion of being loved. Sarah, you just stood up to 15 years of financial fraud and emotional manipulation. You forced people who had all the power in your relationship to be held accountable for their actions. You didn't do this out of spite or revenge. You did it because it was the right thing to do. She was right. But sitting there with legal documents that would change my entire life, I couldn't help but think about the family dinners I'd never have again, the holidays that would be different now, the phone calls that would never come. I wasn't mourning the loss of my actual family. I was mourning the loss of the family I'd always hoped they could become. That night, I called Dr. Williams. I won, I told her. I got everything I asked for. So, why don't I feel victorious? Because victory in a situation like this isn't about winning or losing, she said. It's about finally telling the truth about what happened to you and making sure it doesn't happen again. The sadness you're feeling isn't about the outcome. It's about finally accepting that the family you wanted never actually existed. She was right. The hardest part wasn't fighting my family. It was accepting that they had always been exactly who they revealed themselves to be. I'd just spent 34 years believing they could be different. But as I hung up the phone and looked around my small apartment, I realized something important. For the first time in my adult life, I was financially secure. More than secure, I was free. Free from debt, free from financial anxiety, free from the constant stress of trying to survive on my own while my family hoarded resources they'd stolen from me. And more importantly, I was free from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. If you've ever had to choose between maintaining toxic relationships and protecting your own well-being, you know that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice. But you also know that on the other side of that choice, there's a kind of peace you never knew was possible. The money was life-changing, but it wasn't the money that set me free. It was finally understanding that I deserved better and being willing to fight for it. 6 months after the settlement, I was sitting on the dock of my lake house in New Hampshire, watching the sunrise paint the water gold and marveling at how quiet my mind had become. Not empty, full of plans and possibilities, but quiet in a way it had never been when it was constantly processing family dynamics and trying to decode hidden meanings in every interaction. The financial settlement had changed my life in ways I was still discovering. I'd paid off all my debts, moved into a beautiful apartment in Portland with actual sunlight and space for a home office, and started my own graphic design company. But more importantly, I'd learned what it felt like to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I thought other people expected from me. The cabin had been the biggest surprise. I demanded it in the settlement partly out of spite, partly because it felt like justice, but mainly because I couldn't bear the thought of strangers owning the place where I'd been happiest as a child. I hadn't expected it to become my sanctuary. I'd spent the past month here, working remotely and slowly renovating the place with my own aesthetic instead of the museum-perfect precision my mother had always maintained. I'd painted the kitchen a warm yellow, hung fairy lights on the screened porch, and filled the rooms with books and plants and the kind of comfortable clutter that makes a space feel lived in rather than displayed. But the most surprising change was how I felt about family itself. 3 weeks after the settlement, I'd gotten a call from my cousin Jennifer. "Sarah, I've been thinking about everything you told me, and I owe you an apology. I should have asked more questions instead of just believing what your parents told me. I should have trusted my instincts about who you are instead of accepting their version of events." That conversation had led to others with extended family members, aunts and uncles and cousins who'd been fed the same narrative about my mental instability, but who, when presented with actual facts, began to see the pattern of manipulation they'd witnessed over the years, but never quite named. My Uncle Robert, my father's brother, had been particularly apologetic. "I always wondered why you seemed so anxious at family gatherings," he'd said. "Now I understand you weren't anxious. You were walking on eggshells." These conversations had taught me something crucial. Not all family relationships were toxic. Some people genuinely cared about me and had been misled, just as I'd been misled about so many things for so long. But the people who mattered most, the ones who had chosen to believe lies about me without asking questions, the ones who had participated in excluding me from family decisions, those relationships remained severed. My parents had made no effort to contact me since the settlement meeting. Marcus had sent one text message saying he hoped I was satisfied with myself, then blocked my number. Their silence told me everything I needed to know about the depth of their love and the sincerity of their regrets. I'd also heard through the family grapevine that the financial impact of the settlement had been significant, but not devastating. They'd had to sell some investments and take out a mortgage on their house, but they weren't facing poverty or ruin. Marcus had kept his job, though he'd reportedly become much more conservative in his financial advice to clients, a lesson learned the hard way about the consequences of playing fast and loose with other people's money. The written apology they provided as part of the settlement had been everything I'd asked for: a detailed acknowledgement of the insurance fraud, the trust fund diversions, the pattern of exclusion and manipulation. But it had been written in the language of legal compliance rather than genuine remorse. Still, having it in writing had been important for my own healing, confirmation that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated what had been done to me. Dr. Williams and I had spent many sessions processing the complex emotions that came with winning a fight I'd never wanted to have in the first place. Grief over the loss of the family I'd hoped for. Anger at the years of gaslighting and manipulation. Relief at finally being free. And surprisingly, gratitude. Gratitude. I'd asked her. For what? For the strength you discovered you had. For the people who supported you when it mattered. For the opportunity to build a life based on truth instead of lies. She was right. The legal battle had been horrible, but it had also revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. I'd learned I could be strategic without being cruel, firm without being vindictive, and strong without being defensive. I'd also learned that the voice in my head that had always criticized my choices, questioned my perceptions, and told me I was too sensitive, that voice wasn't mine. It was theirs. And once I'd recognized it as theirs, I could turn the volume down. The business I'd started was thriving in ways I'd never expected. Working for myself, setting my own schedule, choosing clients based on projects that excited me rather than just paying the bills. It felt like I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. But the most profound change was in how I approached relationships. I'd started dating again, slowly and carefully, with a much clearer sense of what I would and wouldn't accept from other people. I'd made new friends who knew nothing about my family drama and liked me simply for who I was. I deepened existing friendships that had been strained by my years of people-pleasing and emotional unavailability. On this particular morning at the lake, I was expecting a visitor. Jennifer had asked if she could bring her teenage daughter Emma up for a weekend. Emma was going through some family drama of her own, feeling overlooked by parents who favored her older brother, and Jennifer thought it might help for her to talk to someone who understood what it felt like to be the less favored child. I'd been nervous about the visit. I didn't want to poison a teenager against her parents, but I also didn't want to minimize her experiences if they were genuinely harmful. In the end, I decided to just listen and share my story honestly, letting her draw her own conclusions. Emma arrived Friday evening with the kind of guarded hostility I remembered from my own teenage years. She was polite but distant, clearly skeptical that an adult could understand anything about her situation. But by Saturday afternoon, as we sat on the dock talking about family dynamics and expectations and the difference between love and control, something had shifted. She wasn't ready to make any dramatic decisions about her relationship with her parents, but she was asking better questions about what she deserved from the people who claimed to love her. "The thing is," she said, "I don't think my parents are bad people. I think they just don't see me clearly." "That's very wise," I told her. "And it's also not your responsibility to make them see you clearly. Your job is to see yourself clearly and to make decisions that protect your well-being." But what if protecting myself hurts them? It was the question I'd struggled with for months during my own legal battle. "Emma, you can't be responsible for other people's feelings about the consequences of their own actions. If your parents are hurt by you setting boundaries, that's information about why the boundaries were necessary, not evidence that you were wrong to set them." We talked until sunset, and when Jennifer came to pick her up Sunday afternoon, Emma looked different. Lighter somehow, like she'd put down a weight she'd been carrying. "Thank you," Jennifer said as they were leaving. "I can see the difference in her already. Whatever you said, it helped." I just told her the truth about what I learned, that you can't save relationships by sacrificing yourself, and that real love doesn't require you to be smaller than you are. After they left, I walked through my cabin now, and thought about the 15-year-old girl who used to lie in the bedroom upstairs and dream about being good enough to earn her family's unconditional love. I wished I could go back and tell her that she was already good enough, that the problem wasn't with her worth but with their ability to see it. But I couldn't go back. I could only move forward, carrying the lessons I'd learned and using them to build something better. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the water, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, my heart raced, thinking it might be one of my parents or Marcus. But it was from Emma. "Thank you for showing me that it's okay to want more from the people who love me. And thank you for showing me what it looks like when someone refuses to settle for less than they deserve." I smiled and typed back, "You never have to settle, Emma. There are people in this world who will love you exactly as you are, without requiring you to earn it or prove you're worthy of it. Don't waste years trying to convince the wrong people to see your value." As I hit send, I realized I was finally giving advice I'd learned to follow myself. The money had been important. It had given me security and freedom and the ability to make choices based on my values rather than my financial desperation. But the real transformation had been internal. I'd stopped asking people to love me and started asking whether they were capable of the kind of love I deserved. The answer, with my family, had been no. And accepting that answer had been the most liberating thing I'd ever done. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. If you're dealing with toxic family dynamics, abusive relationships, or people who've convinced you that you're asking for too much when you ask to be treated with basic respect, I want you to know this. You're not asking for too much. You're not too sensitive. You're not too dramatic. You deserve to be loved without having to earn it. You deserve to have your feelings respected. You deserve to be included in decisions that affect your life. And you deserve to walk away from people who consistently make you feel like you're not enough, even if those people are family. It won't be easy. It might cost you relationships you thought you couldn't live without. But on the other side of that loss, there's a kind of peace and self-respect that's worth everything you'll have to give up to get it. Subscribe if this story resonated with you, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Whether you're in a small town or a big city, whether you're dealing with family drama or toxic friendships or workplace bullying, remember that you have more power than you think you do. Sometimes you just have to be willing to use it. The sun was setting over my lake, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about what tomorrow would bring. Whatever happened, I knew I could handle it. I'd already survived the worst thing I could imagine, losing my family, and discovered that what I'd actually lost was the burden of trying to be someone I wasn't for people who were never going to appreciate who I was. The girl who used to beg for scraps of affection was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to protect it. And that, more than any amount of money or property, was the real victory.